Facebook is getting ready, then I will go live on Zoom as well. Okay, here we go. Just count to 10 and then go, okay?
Hi, this is WIllis Krumholz with Alpha News. This is the August 11th edition of the First Tuesday Conservatives group, the coronavirus remote live stream edition. We have three panelists today. We're going to be talking about the 1619 project by the New York Times, and specifically by Nikole Hannah-Jones. And it's been a pretty controversial project to change how America views its history, to say the least. So our first panelist is going to be Senior Policy Fellow at the Center of the American Experiment, Kersten. The second panelist is Rebekah Hagstrom. She's the headmaster of Liberty Classical Academy in White Bear Lake. And Rebekah co-hosts a podcast, and she should correct me if it's probably a radio show called Education Nation Minnesota with Marc Durkin. And he's the executive producer of that show and the co-host. And so Marc Durkin is our third panelist. So Education Nation Minnesota is something everybody should look up after they view this. You have to type in the Minnesota at the end, otherwise you're going to get an NBC education website. It has to be Education Nation Minnesota.
EdNationMN.org, WIllis. EdNationMN.org. And it's both podcast and radio. Yeah.
Okay, great. That's why I was confused. So no, thanks for being here, Catherine, Rebekah, and Marc. And we're just going to let the panelists take it off from here. I think we should just start telling the viewers what the 1619 project is. I think some people have heard of it. I don't think a lot of people actually know the details and what it's trying to do. So somebody take us from here.
Well, I can start. The 1619 project was launched by the New York Times in August 2019 with the goal of changing Americans' vision of what their nation is all about and where it came from. The fundamental idea was that our nation's true founding occurred not in 1776 with the Declaration of Independence, but in 1619, which was the year that 20 Black slaves first came ashore at Jamestown. And the premise is that America is racist in its very DNA. The idea is that everything exceptional about America springs from slavery. And the conclusion that the Times wants people to draw is that our nation needs a wholesale transformation of its cultural and social and political institutions in order to essentially overcome what they're portraying as our original sin.
Yeah, that's a good synopsis, Kathy. So one of the things that the 1619 project says based on that is that the very reason the founders wanted to be independent from Britain was slavery. And then Nikole Hannah-Jones had to walk that back and say, well, some of the founders wanted to be independent because of slavery. Can you talk about that a little bit? And some of the other claims that the author of this, who we'll get into, Miss Hannah-Jones, makes about the founders.
Rebekah, Marc, would you like to?
Yep. Well, I think that one of the things that we need to keep in mind is that our founders, if you go all the way back to the Pilgrims, they came clearly for religious freedom, and that's very well documented. And I find it really kind of appalling, actually, because it is so well documented that she would make that claim, that it was to escape, to prevent them from being able to have slaves. I really am glad that she at least had the courage to walk that back a little bit. But what concerns me is that they are very they're very direct on their website that they want to reframe America's history around slavery. So while she may have walked back that particular fact, she's still claiming that our whole historical underpinnings of our country revolve around slavery. And while slavery was clearly an issue, that is certainly not at all what our founders had in mind. They had in mind religious freedom. They had in mind the equality of man, human beings, all, and that was very well documented. And I find that to be very concerning. That's actually one of the biggest reasons why I'm concerned about the 1619 Project, because it places America's founding in a really negative light. And it's not at all honest with what is the truth.
Sure. Marc, do you have anything to add? Go ahead.
I'll just add real briefly too. You know, Catherine made a wonderful point when we had her on the program, that there were a group of concerned college professors that actually launched the 1620 Project.
Mm-hmm.
And this goes along the lines of this pursuit for religious freedom, religious liberty. The Pilgrims, they arrived at Plymouth Rock in Massachusetts as part of the Mayflower Compact. They brought their families, and it was unlike the Jamestown colony. And Catherine really made a great distinction through her research of the fact that, you know, the values that were being espoused with the Pilgrims coming over in the Northeast up in Massachusetts, far different from what took place in the Jamestown colony. And that is certainly a project that is worth investigating, looking into, and to really combat the lies that are coming through the 1619 Project.
Mm-hmm.
Sure. I'll ask a several-pronged answer, and you guys can kind of just run with it. So how does Nicole Hannah-Jones, the author of this 1619 Project, confront some of the nuances? So I think anybody would agree that slavery was America's original sin, right? Conservatives agree with that. The founding fathers agree with that, right? If you look at the writings of Jefferson, for example, who was a pro-slavery guy who owned slaves, he talked about slavery being America's original sin. That was language that was then echoed by Abraham Lincoln. Does Nicole Hannah-Jones just completely discount that? And then to jump to another question that's somewhat related, there's a lot of documentation. I think de Tocqueville is the most famous one, where, you know, of course, America's economy was slave dependent, but a lot of people noticed how there was a huge difference in the quality of the economy in the free North versus the South. So just using de Tocqueville for an example, he noticed that the same geography, similar resources, you could go on the northern side and see people employed, everybody was working, the town was clean. You went on the southern side where slavery was prevalent, and there was a lot of poor white men who were shiftless, who weren't working, because why would somebody hire them when slave labor was free? And then when slaves worked, they obviously had no incentive, or weren't making anything for themselves. And de Tocqueville even wrote about that. So does Nicole Hannah-Jones acknowledge some of that nuance, that yes, it was a part of America's economy, but no, it wasn't a win-win to have slaves?
Well, Nicole Hannah-Jones isn't known for nuance. If you look at the historical record, you will see that, as you say, Will, slavery was very controversial. It was something that was here when our nation was founded, right? Over 150 years before, brought to the New World, brought at least to Jamestown by the British, who later went on to be among those who were the nation that was among the first to abolish slavery. That's the kind of thing that Nicole Hannah-Jones tends to ignore. But slavery was actually on its way out in the South. We should recognize first that right after the Revolution, 6 of the original 13 colonies abolished slavery in the North. And obviously it fell off very, very quickly. In 1787, the Northwest Ordinance abolished slavery in the vast new territories that we had from Britain after the war. But slavery was on its way out because it simply wasn't efficient, even in the South, until the cotton gin was invented, right? And that's when it took off again. And so the founders originally expected it essentially to die out on its own. Now I've forgotten the second point that you made.
He was asking, does Hannah Jones acknowledge that? And one of the things that I would say is, based on one of her tweets, her response to some of the arguments that her historical elements are inaccurate is, well, I didn't say that it was the origin story of America. I said it is an.
We might have just lost Rebekah there because of the internet.
Yes.
Origin story. Am I back? Did you
Yes,
get all of that, or do I need to
You're
repeat
back.
myself?
Repeat
Okay,
yourself.
I'm not sure where you lost me, but
So-
Hannah Jones says it's not the American origin story. She says it's an American origin story, which I couldn't help but to be reminded of President Clinton's comment about depends on what the definition of the word is. And, trying to create some type of a narrative, really saying that truth doesn't matter, which, we know there's been a push on the left for a long time to say that truth doesn't matter. It's the narrative that matters, and that's what wins the day. So if they can get this narrative through, and by the way, American education right now has been appallingly poor at teaching true American history.
Mhm.
So now with this new project coming in and people really clamoring to put this in some of the public schools, and I'm sure some of the private schools will take it too, you're putting this at a time when the students haven't really had genuine American history. So they don't have what those of us on this podcast have, which is the background to know. So if you combine that, you have a lack of history understanding, and you get taught the 1619 Project as an origin story, that's going to become the prevailing thought for those students who end up receiving that. And that's a very concerning matter for the future of our country and our citizens.
Yeah, the statements that Nicole Hannah Jones made about simply referring to slavery as an origin story is disingenuous. What the
Yeah.
Times said is they are putting slavery at the very center, quote, the very center of the story about American history. But to your point, Will, your question about the economy in the colonial period, certainly the emphasis that the Times wants to place on the importance of slavery to the American economy is essentially and ironically a kind of revival of the claim of the Southern leaders like John Calhoun that cotton was king in the South. This cotton was king really in the nation. If that had been true, the South would have won the Civil War, right? The North was always far more advanced, far more industrial, and an economy that was something like 10 times the size of the Southern economy. So again, that's a very disingenuous claim that America's economy then and now are the result of of dirty lucre from slavery.
Mhm.
Sure. And you can see the advance in the South's economy just even in the last 70 years now that Jim Crow and segregation have been wiped out. Go ahead. You were going to maybe say something, Rebekah.
Yeah, I was. There was an article that was sent to me by Devin Foley from International Takeout that was written by, let's see, he's from Pennsylvania. Help me out here. Alexander Riley at Bucknell. And he talked about how prior to the 1967 book, Black Power, that there had already been a shift from a lot of the Black people living in the South coming up into the North. And the whole reason for that being that the economy was better up in the North. And so to say that it was built on the back of slavery is only part of the story. And clearly, if they wanted to emigrate north, the reason I'm sure is that they wanted to have more economic opportunity, more freedom, more equality, because they knew those values were much more aligned with the Northerners in general. Obviously, there's been exceptions, but in general. So that to me also flies in the face of this idea that capitalism was built on those backs. And another point, Catherine, that you made on our show is that only a small percentage of the slave trade, of the Atlantic slave trade, actually came to the US. Most of it came to Latin America and South America, I believe you said, and a lot to Brazil. And yet we certainly don't see those parts of the Americas being the highly successful capitalistic economies. So if her reasoning, her logic held true, you'd expect that it would have been Latin and South America that would have been much more successful than the US.
And a central point to make there is that slavery has been a universal institution throughout American history. I tried to go through the whole 1619 project, which includes something like 30 entries, articles, pieces of art, poetry, and that kind of thing, to look for some kind of admission that slavery was not unique to the United States of America. It was an institution that was everywhere in the world from ancient times. And even today, there are an estimated 40 million slaves, or people held essentially in slavery around the world. Rebekah, in talking about the Atlantic slave trade, it's important to point out that the Arabs traded slaves, including from Africa, for 13 centuries, and sent millions of people, mostly to Asia and the Middle East. In the New World, it was only 5% of slaves over the 3 centuries of the Atlantic slave trade who came to North America, or at least the territory that became the United States. 95% in the Caribbean and Latin America, with 40% in Brazil. It was only in the West that this institution was ever questioned or reformed. And today, we see people like Nicole Hannah-Jones using ideas and principles, notions of equal right and human dignity that arose only in the West, to criticize only the West and to revile the very creators of those moral principles that she claims to hold. So it's deeply dishonest, and it's a smear on the truth of American history.
Thanks, Kathy. That's a good point. I just wanted to add really quick, and Marc can jump in if he wants to. I wanted to add that if viewers have questions, just pop it into the chat, and I'll try to get to any questions that we have. And then just really quick on that, I just want to follow up on that Brazil and Arab world trading slaves point. A lot of people don't know that a lot of slaves went to the Arab world or were traded there and then to somewhere else, and their ancestors aren't around today because a lot of them were treated so terribly they died. In Brazil, which had slavery longer than the US did, there were bodies floating in the harbor in Sao Paulo. I mean, slavery is evil no matter what, but the level of cruelty and insidiousness that went on in even Brazil, for example, more people need to learn about that. Not to say what America did was okay at all, but to understand the global context of this. And I appreciate you guys bringing that up.
Yeah, and that's where, if Hannah-Jones were sitting in this podcast with us, she would probably say, I'm guessing, that doesn't really matter because we're talking about the US, is probably what she would say. But then I would go back to what Catherine was saying, and that is that this country in truth was founded on the idea that every man is created equal and has value by our Creator. And it would be so much more beneficial if she really wants to try to help our country remove the vestiges of racism that are still present in our culture, it'd be so much more valuable for her to go back to focus on what this country was founded on in truth. And then let's take that and value that, and let's see, how do we work together then as a whole country to work towards solutions that are beneficial. Right now, I feel like what it's doing is it's actually causing more division, more segregation. It's almost like it's going to end up going back to the very thing they were fighting against, segregation. And it's becoming more segregated as they try to make these arguments.
The thing I find too that is a glaring omission too in this discussion is that when these questions start to arise and these points are being made, we never talk about the progress that has been made since the days of slavery. Of course, right after the war, there was the passage and ratification of the 13th, the 14th, and the 15th Amendments to the U.S. Constitution, of course, guaranteeing the legal equality and the right to vote. We don't talk about the landmark Supreme Court case in the 20th century of the Brown versus Board of Education. Then there was the Holding Act, the 1964 Civil Rights Act. So there has been a lot of progress, of course, that has been made in assuring that that all men are created and are treated equally. And so let's also build upon some of the momentum that has taken place over the last century that has brought us closer to where all men are truly being created equally.
Sure.
And a viewer I saw just pointed out that your volume should be turned up.
I am all.
Can you do that?
Yes.
You have such a calming voice, Marc,
That's the
problem. Turning
more inflection, right?
They want you to yell in the microphone.
Yeah.
So you guys have mentioned the founding a lot, and I wanted to ask a specific question about the Constitution, and then I think we should get into some of the comments made by Nicole Hannah-Jones. So I'm thinking of the Jefferson quote, and somebody can correct me if I'm getting it wrong, but even Jefferson said, "I shudder to think that God is just, and that His mercy doesn't sleep forever." Right. So there was clearly an acknowledgement about the problems of slavery. From my perspective, that was written into the Constitution. The 3/5 compromise was a way for the North to start to, edge slavery out of the South. The transatlantic slave trade was banned in the Constitution. But according to Nicole Hannah-Jones, she says the Constitution legitimized slavery in the U.S. So if somebody could talk about some of the specific things she's saying and why that's wrong.
Mm-hmm.
Well, she certainly disagrees on that with Frederick Douglass, former slave and an icon of the civil rights movement. As I recall, he called the Constitution a glorious liberty document. The Constitution doesn't even use the word slavery. My understanding is that those who wrote it were very uncomfortable with the term. They wanted to see it end. The Congress did end the slave trade itself, the Atlantic slave trade, as early as it was possible under the Constitution in 1808. And then as we all know, the Civil War, 50 years later, was fought with 360,000 Union soldiers who lost their lives in a successful attempt to end slavery, followed by the three amendments that Marc just named. To the point, was it Rebekah, I think, who made it, that Hannah-Jones would say, well, we're only talking about the United States, and therefore what's happened throughout the history of humanity and what's happened around the world is irrelevant. Of course it's not. It's absolutely central to understanding the exceptionalism of the United States. We all know that man is inhumane to man. What makes America exceptional is not that we had slavery at one point. It is that we had this bold and radical experiment for the first time in history announcing that all men were created equal. And then, as Marc says, moving on from there to victory after victory over the taint of slavery. And the last 60 years has just been an incredible record of attempts to open up opportunity in every way to every human being in America.
Mhm.
And
Well said.
where else has that happened?
Well said. Yep. Yep.
Do you, Marc or Rebekah, do you have anything to add there?
Do not.
I would point out that one interesting thing is the inequality racially in the North, which is disproportionately run by the left, like states like Minnesota or Illinois, is worse than it is in the South today. But that is lost on people. But go ahead, Marc.
No, I had nothing to add.
Okay. So we have a viewer who asks a good question that basically says, how much of the current riots and protests we see today are because of the 1619 project? And I would maybe put a twist onto that and say the 1619 project came about in late 2019, but there's been these strains in history being taught to our kids, especially in colleges. And I even experienced that at Bethel University, which is a private Christian school. So how much of the discontent and what you see with the youth is being fueled by this? Yeah, that's.
I personally don't think that the 1619 project is what's fueling this right now, but I think that if 1619 gets into our school system, which is their goal, they've already written curriculum. And I think last year they were already in Washington, D.C. and in Maryland and Chicago in a lot of their public schools, and maybe privates too, I'm not sure. But a lot of schools already adopted a lot of this. I personally heard from one of my former students who's a math teacher in one of the English teacher is proposing that the 6th and 7th grade English and history get completely
Rebekah, go ahead, Rebekah. Keep going. You cut out a little bit.
Okay, sorry. I don't know where you
You're
lost
fine.
me, but that I'm sure part of what this proposal is to replace history and English for 6th and 7th grade, to replace it with George Floyd, information and conversation. Well, 2 full years of 2 subjects, you can't just talk about George Floyd that long. So what are you going to do? I suppose you're maybe going to look at things like the 1619 project. So I personally think what we're seeing is more a result of things that have been in the works for a long time in the universities, the leftist culture that really promotes this idea that, because really before 1619, we still had this notion that slavery is at the foundation, right? That's been promoted deeply in a lot of our colleges and K-12 schools. So, but sure, I still see it as problematic for going forward.
So I want to get into what Nicole Hannah-Jones has said, and she's actually said some stuff about the recent riots. A listener asked, what did I get taught at Bethel? And I don't want to make this thing about me or bashing Bethel, but really quickly, when I went to Bethel and I graduated in 2011, what they did is they had all the minority students come in a week early, and they taught them how Bethel was a racist place, and there was a noose hung up in the 80s or 90s or something. And you think about what happens with college students when they first show up to college, they make friends with people that they first see. So I showed up being this white kid from a small town, and I noticed that all the black kids were already kind of, hanging out with each other. And I ended up being friends with a couple guys, and found this out later, maybe as a junior. So 3 years later, that they had all kind of been shipped there a week early. And one of the things they were told is that, hey, you should sign up for this reconciliation studies major, which Bethel no longer has. But I guarantee the graduation and employment and salary rates for that thing were just terrible, which is why they scrapped it. So why not encourage these kids to be business majors? And then really quick, in Bethel classes, There was one class where a professor said, we weren't the good guys in World War II. There was another class where they had the picture of the signing of the Declaration of Independence. It's the famous painting. And I think it's done by Constantino Bermudi. I might be butchering his name. And you can look at the faces of everybody on there, and it's actually like a signer. They sat them down after the fact. And the professor had this big picture up in class, and she said, well, what do all these people have in common? And a student raised their hand and said, well, they're all white guys. And the professor said, that's exactly right. Like, that was the takeaway, when a lot of these guys risked life and limb and property to do this. And then I'm almost done with my diatribe, but another instance at Bethel, and this is probably the most ridiculous, and this would have been back in like 2009 or 8. They had a woman come into this giant class called Christianity and Western Culture. And her whole purpose was to teach about how Islam was a religion of peace. And I'm not an anti-Muslim or any, but like it was like Islam doesn't mistreat women, and Muhammad was a peaceful conqueror and all this stuff. And I probably shouldn't say this on live stream, but one of her examples as to why Islam wasn't didn't mistreat women was because, well, hey, and it's a classic straw man, right? She said, well, hey, the reason that men are put in the front of the mosque and women are made to sit in the back of the mosque is the sexual position in the Middle East is, is if the woman is bent over, and so they can't have men and women praying next to each other because that would distract the men. And she actually said this at Bethel in a class of 150 kids. And I'm sorry I'm even saying this here, but it was so ridiculous. And that was at Bethel University in 2009. So I can imagine it's gotten worse since then. Sorry for going off about that. But
what we're seeing here is an example of the adversary culture. That is the culture of disaffected intellectuals, alienated and estranged from their own nation for a wide variety of reasons. Actually, this is something I'm writing about now. But I think it's important to point out that although the 1619 project isn't itself what's firing crowds in the street, it is the racial identity politics that underlies the 1619 project. It's the notion which is so counter to the vision of Martin Luther King, the vision of the original American Civil Rights Revolution, which is that we are judged by the content of our character as individuals. This racial identity politics ideology holds just the opposite. It holds that we are members of racial groups first and foremost, and only secondarily are we individual human beings. And the idea that a teacher could point to these World War II veterans, or whoever it was who was saying she was dismissing as all white men, I mean, that is so juvenile and so illogical and so counter to what Frederick Douglass and Martin Luther King believed, and very, very dangerous in a multi-ethnic society like ours.
Yeah, and it completely goes against what the whole founding purpose was. And that was, the term melting pot is almost a banned word these days, right? And yet that was the idea of the founders. And that is what they wanted, was a melting pot where we did come together as various people groups and various races. And all throughout history, people are sinful. And so there has been, harsh treatment of immigrants all the way around the way. I mean, certainly not enslaved in every case, but often not treated well. My own mother talks about having the different elements of, Sweden and Norway. So Swedish and Norwegian Lutheran churches on kitty corners in her little town. And if you went to the Swedish Lutheran church, you were not going to work or talk with the people that went to the Norwegian Swedish, Lutheran church. So, or the Norwegian Lutheran church. So I'm getting a little bit off here, but the point I'm trying to make is that immigrants from Europe were also mistreated. If you look at the history of St. Paul and look at the East Side, you'll see that there is a timeline that you can follow based on when various people groups were emigrating to Minnesota. And they were all looked upon poorly when they first came. And that's the sin of mankind. That is not okay. And obviously slavery is horrendous. But what I would like to see is a return to the notion that every man is created equal and everyone is created to be a unique and special individual in the image of God. And that is what's truly going to bring genuine unity rather than separation, as Catherine pointed out, the racial identity politics.
And
Sure.
the central point here is that immigrants of every conceivable racial background have flooded to this country for
Yeah, that's another good
300
point.
years. This is the reality. New York Times aside, the facts make clear that people of all races have seen this nation throughout its history as a beacon of light and a beacon of hope and opportunity.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I didn't mean to pull us off topic too much about the Bethel comment, but really that gets us into a point I really wanted to get to is what do we do about this? Because Tom Cotton has a bill to cut federal funding to school districts if they teach the 1619 project. I'm sure everybody here is in agreement about that. Please comment if you have other ideas. But really this has started and for a long time, it's just kind of what I was getting to in the universities. If that stuff is being taught at Bethel University, where kids are being sent there by their parents who care about getting a Christian education and et cetera, the stuff going on at the U has got to be, and I kind of know it's 10 or 20 times worse. So what do we do about that? Is it hopeless? Do we start over? Is it a policy response issue?
I'm going to jump in and say, I really think it comes down to parents paying attention and researching. I really believe that part of how we've ended up where we are today is that for a long time, our schools supported the general notion that America is good, that it was founded on Judeo-Christian principles, principles from the Enlightenment, and that was supported in the school. And then, there's been a lot of transition, but starting in the 1920s, we started to see a little bit of change in the public schools. Then in 62 and 63, Bible reading and prayer got removed from the public schools. And slowly you've seen this creeping of our school system into a much more leftist stance. And all the while, we parents, we're busy. Everybody's busy. You're busy going about your lives and you're thinking, well, I went to public schools and I turned out okay. So I guess it's okay for my kids to go. And I want to be clear that this notion isn't just in the public schools. This is in a lot of private schools too. So that's a very important distinction here. But I guess what I would say is parents have for too long been able to sort of be hands off when it comes to their children's K-12 education. And the powers that be, the secularists, have understood that, and they got a hold of K-12 education a long time ago and have slowly changed the foundation and the purpose of education to be much more that of social change rather than sharing the continuation of the principles that made this country great. And that used to be the goal of education, was sharing our traditions and our values and educating students to be able to learn and think on their own the way a classical education does. But unfortunately, that's changed a lot. So I would tell parents, please start paying attention to what your children are learning and what they're not learning, by the way. Sometimes that's even more instructive. And get involved at the school board level. But frankly, a lot of this is coming down even above the school boards. So then I would then press for classical education. I'm obviously a classical educator. Classical education operates from a historical standpoint on primary documents. So that means you're looking at what the historical figures themselves had to say about these topics, rather than a revisionist person like Hannah Jones or someone else coming in. I mean, frankly, revisionist history has been a problem in our American schools for a long time. This is just sort of the culmination of it all. So get involved, look into classical education. There's a lot of classical schools around the Twin Cities, and then push for that, because we could be doing more classical education broadly. It doesn't have to just be in these particular schools. It is a methodology that works, and I would love to see it more widespread across America.
Sure. And we should have gotten to this earlier, but I'd love for Catherine to comment on who Nikole Hannah-Jones is, what drives her, the stuff she said. And then if Catherine and Marc both want to get back to this idea of, I think there's some great comments there about K through 12, but what do we do about higher education in America? And you can jump in on that too, Rebekah.
Well, unfortunately, Nikole Hannah-Jones is a graduate of my alma mater, which is the University of Notre Dame. She is a member of what I've called the adversary culture, obviously. She is interested, along with the majority, clearly, of the New York Times staff, in driving radical political and social and cultural transformation in America. You may have read recently that 2 editors at the New York Times were forced to resign over the fact that Senator Tom Cotton's editorial, which the staff apparently disagreed with, was allowed to appear in the New York Times. That's the kind of cancel culture, the kinds of intolerance that people with the mindset of Nikole Hannah-Jones seem to have. Not exactly the people we want to have us teaching our children in American schools. But I should point out that her ambitions are much broader than merely getting curricula into American K-12 schools. And I understand, along with the Pulitzer Center, there are something like 4,500 American schools that have now agreed to use the 1619 curriculum in some form. But Nikole Hannah-Jones now has an agreement with Oprah Winfrey, and they are going to be doing movies, TV shows, etc., that will reach a much broader American population with these falsehoods. So what do we do about it? Well, one thing we can do is to inform ourselves about the truth. And there we have the benefit of some work that Robert Woodson has done, a wonderful Black commentator. He's put together something called the 1716 Unites Project, where he has a number of distinguished Black commentators who are pushing back against the 1619 project and making clear that it's absolutely devastating to freedom and opportunity in this country. So you can go to the 1716 Unites Robert Woodson website for that. The National Association of Scholars is the group of professors who has put together this 1620 project. They're actually writing a book that will counter the untruths in the 1619 project. They have some great stuff on their website. The Heritage Foundation is working on this, the Manhattan Institute. We're going to be seeing parent toolkits that will be coming out to help parents understand what is really going on with this, and videos that will explain it. The Bill of Rights Institute is involved. So there are people who are speaking the truth about the falsehoods that are being sold to us by the New York Times, and that should be encouraging.
I'll just add also too, David Barton from Wall Builders. It's another great organization. They've been just faithfully, opening up all of the original documents and a lot of the quotations from a lot of the founding fathers and how they felt about the founding of the nation as well too. That's been a very faithful organization as well too, with a very robust library of the founding of the nation as well.
Great. Is there a policy? I don't want to just dwell on this too much, but is there an appropriate policy response? I mean, we elect politicians because they're supposed to do something about this stuff, correct? And I kind of back to what I was going off of earlier. is, I mean, from my perspective, when I started reading about the 1619 Project, a lot of it was just an amalgamation of stuff I had been taught in college. So is there a policy response here?
I would say, I mean, again, I'm going to go more high level and say the best policy response is school choice legislation. The only way we're going to get change in the way our schools address issues like this is to provide parents the opportunity to get their kids into the schools that they want. And, you know, when I think about all of the kids that are in schools where, for whatever reason, parents don't have the opportunity to make a difference or make a change, they need the power to be able to make a change and send their child to a school where they can learn history the way it truly happened, rather than an version, as Hannah Jones says. So I think that's one of the best policy issues, is to be pushing school choice legislation.
Sure.
If you are a grandparent that's listening to this, I would suggest that you talk to your churches and ask them about developing funds to provide scholarships for students to attend private schools of their choice in the area. Even if they can't receive a tax deduction, I would like to see churches helping students more. And I would like to see our older generation, who is probably appalled by what they hear about the 1619 Project, say, you know what, I'm going to support some of these young families that don't have the funds to be able to send their children to private school. Maybe it's their own grandchildren, and give them that opportunity to find a school that really does teach history factually.
I think that's an awesome idea. And I'm going to probably get in trouble here too, but I would remind people that the Republicans in St. Paul every year or every other year in the bonding bill fund Minnesota's universities, maybe a little bit less than the Democrats would. And then Republicans federally reauthorize the Higher Education Act every time it comes up. So just throwing that out there. Is there a watcher, listener asked, is there an anti-Christian element to some of this, right? I mean, the church has been on multiple sides of this issue over history, and there was Christians involved in the other Underground Railroad. There was also Christians who were trying to justify slavery using the Bible. But is Nicole Hannah Jones's efforts rooted in some sort of rabid secularism?
I would say absolutely. Catherine might want to address this too, but you know, that's again, when I said that it's been taught maybe not quite correctly in the schools for a long time. That's the narrative that our American school children have heard, again, in both public and private schools, that it was the Christians who supported slavery in the South through a couple of minor passages in the Bible, as though there were no Christians that fought against slavery. And Christians were extremely outspoken against slavery, both here in America and in Europe as well. And we need to be reminding, that's another point why knowing your history is so important, because otherwise you're condemned to falsehoods, and you think that you buy into that narrative that, oh, it was the Christians that perpetuated slavery. And that's not at all the case. Same thing with the Democrat versus Republican. You know, it was years before I learned that it was actually the Democrats that were the ones that were voting for the racist policies in the South. And it was the Republicans generally, this is of course generally, it was generally the Republicans that were supporting the freedom of the American slaves. And so I just think, yes, absolutely, that anti-Christian element is very much a part of this.
Yeah, just to add really quick, and I'm probably going to get an email, and I'm not trying to rip on Bethel too much, but I learned about the Christians in the South supporting slavery. I never learned about William Wilberforce until excuse me, something just came up on my phone. I didn't learn about William Wilberforce in college, which is sad.
It's really unfortunate. That's huge.
Is that
Yeah.
the abolition movement, which only occurred in the West, right, was essentially a Christian-led movement. This is so much more important than the aberrant people in the South who were self-interested, who would have argued for slavery. And I just read actually W.E.B. Du Bois' book.
Just going to bring him up.
Black Voice, yeah, 1903. He was one of the first Black intellectuals after the Civil War, very influential. He writes about the women who came down immediately after the Civil War from New England. They were called the school marms, and they came down and volunteered to teach thousands and thousands of children who had been slaves so that they could learn to read and write as a labor of love. These kinds of things are simply never talked about. But in terms of the secularism, the hostility to Christianity and faith generally of people like Nicole Hannah-Jones, this notion of racial identity politics, that we are first and foremost members of racial groups, is so profoundly contrary to Christian teaching about the importance, the dignity of the soul of each individual human being. The two just don't mesh, right? It's hard to see how you can hold that vision and still believe that human beings actually are equal, rather than simply being the sort of wards of the state whose rights may or may not be recognized by the central authority.
Right.
Sure.
And to as Hannah-Jones, or even your professor, WIllis, that says, well, this was just a bunch of white men. You don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. You have to look at cultural context at the time. And just because it was all white men doesn't disregard the views that they were trying to perpetuate. I mean, we now as women, it took I think longer actually than for our Black neighbors to be able to vote, right? So women were very much in the same category, and that's what you see with this identity politics. Is it's whatever minority issue that you have. If you're Black and you're female and you're transgender, well then by far you have the most trouble. And focusing on those differences isn't helping. It's not bringing unity to our country. And I would love to know what their ultimate goal is. Is it truly the destruction of America? Because that's where things appear to be going. And we have to then, as people who believe in the founding, we have to stand up for the truth of our founding, and we can't be afraid to speak out. We can't be afraid to tell the truth, and we need to look into what that truth is if we don't really know what it is.
Marc, did you have anything to add? Oh, go ahead, Rebekah.
Well, I have one more comment about Du Bois. I actually just in the last few days read an article that came through my email stream of a woman. She's a Black woman who was raised in Maryland, and she tells a story about her mom and dad starting a classical Christian school. And the way it all came about, her mother found a pamphlet on classical Christian education. Long story short, she, as a young Black woman, I think she attended NYU for her master's degree, could not even fathom why her mom and dad want to start a classical school. She said, why would you guys want to start a school and talk about this great conversation with all these people that are completely disconnected from Black history? And she tells a story about how she was slowly transformed through her parents, who had seen themselves the truth of the reality that all men are created equal, and they all have access to be part of the great conversation. And she said the book that really transformed her thinking on this issue was the Du Bois book that Catherine just mentioned a little while ago. And that he commented, I have not read the book, but now I want to. Evidently, he commented on the fact that it's really important for Black Americans to not be dependent on white people to give them their value, but to find their value in themselves through their basis of that they are an individual created in the image of God. And I really think that that's an important concept, and that's what transformed her. And now she very much believes in being part of the great conversation. And she comments, though, that she's run into pushback from both Blacks and whites on this topic, that there is access to history. So I do believe today that we still are seeing racism that is not okay. But I don't believe that the way to go about this is the way Hannah Jones is trying to do with 1619.
Yeah, that's a good point, and one that isn't made enough, that racism exists, but the racism is measured in terms of economic equality or inequality, right? And the left is never going to do something to fix that economic inequality. So by definition, racism will always be a problem. But I wanted to, we have about 5 minutes left, and I think that Marc and Catherine could just, and Rebekah then, should just make some closing comments if they have them. I have a suggested topic, which is, and we've gotten into this a little bit already, but why does the left want to reframe our history like this? And it's clearly not just a radical, I think it's Marxist, but it's not just like a far left thing, because it's Oprah Winfrey, it's corporations, it's highly paid university professors that drive imported cars. So why do they want to do this, and what's driving it? And you'd even brought this up. Where are they going with this, and how do we stop it? And that's a big mouthful, but if somebody has something to say there.
I'll let Catherine or Marc talk. Yeah.
Go ahead. I'll just briefly, state, as a Christian, I tend to see things really through a biblical lens. I mean, we can see that America is obviously kind of that last. It's the only constitutional republic, but in terms of its standing, in terms of all of what it has stood for over the course of hundreds of years, it really is the last gate that needs to be shut before really a whole globalist system is put into place. And I really feel like that there is such an attack on this country to ultimately try to conform and bring us in line with a lot of the global agendas that are really taking place in the earth right now.
I would say, just very briefly, the end game is power for the left. For people like Oprah Winfrey, I think it's a kind of uninformed idealism. But people like Oprah are being used, in my view, by people who are very interested in transforming all of our institutions in a way that will give them the levers of power.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I would agree with both of their comments that to teach a revisionist type of history is to detach our people from our roots and our foundation. And I believe part of that is to detach us also from our Christian foundation. That is what was at the root of this country, is Judeo-Christian values, not just Christianity, but from the Enlightenment, this value that we can reason, that we can hold all men as created equal. And so if there can be a detachment of our modern day people from the foundation, then you can control much more easily. You can move people in whatever direction you want to go, which is what we're seeing happening with Hannah Jones and the 1619 Project. And so I would agree that the most important thing that people can do is educate themselves and speak out about it.
Great comments. And that's really the point of the First Tuesday Conservatives group, which is to inform, educate, and encourage conservatives to action. So I just really hope that anybody watching this will share it. Please take what you've seen here and ask more questions, look up more of this, more on this topic, and educate your friends and family about it. So really quick, so the radio show and podcast that Marc and Rebekah have is Education Nation Minnesota. Rebekah, will you give the internet address for that one more time?
Sure. Thank you. ednationmn.org. ednationmn.org. And that's where we store all of our podcasts. And
Great.
You can go back and you can listen to the show that we did with Catherine back at the end of February. And we cover all sorts of topics that are pertinent to education, both locally and nationwide.
Great. And Catherine, Kersten's great work can be found on Center of the American Experiment's website, and just Google Center of the American Experiment. And to the three panelists, thank you all for doing this today. It's been an awesome conversation. I'm guessing we could talk for hours and hours about this stuff, and maybe they'll let us all be back on again. My name is WIllis Krumholz with Alpha News, and I appreciate everybody tuning in today. Thank you.
Thank you very much.